So this is everybody, isn't it? Okay. Shall we begin? Good morning. So, this is the last lecture. The material I am presenting, I have many versions of. There are some versions that are short, some that are longer. The longest version is the manuscript of a book. So, and I know different people have different versions of this material. So, I just thought I would say before I begin, if you have some version, that what I'm going to do today is select some topics from what you have. So, whichever version you have, this will be very compressed today. What I want to do today is mention some forms of insight I think can flow from the taxonomy we've been learning how to use the last 2 days. I actually think there are many forms of insight that come from this. Many more than I realized when I first started working on this, which is why it's become so long. But I will mention 3 more today. And I will mention these each somewhat briefly. Probably much more, I will discuss each of these things probably much more briefly than in whatever version you have. And my thought is then, after an hour, I'll stop, and then in the discussion, we can go into detail where you want. I'll let you steer me towards more detail. So, in the first lecture, I did mention one form of insight that I thought could come from having this taxonomy. That was, if you could recognize different variants of, say, Cartesian skepticism, then you could realize that although you're working in a different area of philosophy, you're working on the same problem again. It has the same structure. And so, if something worked here, it should work there. If you think it doesn't work there, then you should think it doesn't work here. But there's a sense in which you yourself are inconsistent if you encounter a problem of exactly the same form, but simply because of the clothing, you think that it has a different body. But that's a point. That first insight is really a point about the homology of variance within a variety. Be they variants of Cartesian skepticism or variants of Kantian skepticism. All the forms of insight I want to talk about today only come into play if we are concerned about the relation between the varieties. Relation between, say, a variant of Cartesian skepticism and a variant of Kantian skepticism. The more interesting forms of insight, I think, come only when we ask this larger question. So the next form of insight, so the second form of insight that we will be discussing in these lectures then, that a perspicuous overview of varieties of skepticism affords, I think, has to do with distinguishing very different things that different philosophers, or sometimes even the same philosopher, can mean when they employ certain kinds of vocabulary. So you have a word in this philosopher, you have a word in that philosopher, and the question is how to understand what the word is doing. So first, this is a point about words. In a moment, I'll have a point about sentences, and then I'll have a point about paragraphs, and then there'll be a point about books. But let's start with a point about words. You have a word, and the question is, what is this word doing? What does it mean? How should we understand it? What kind of philosophical problematic does it belong to? And the first word about which I want to make this point, the most obvious one, it should already be obvious from the first 2 lectures, is the word skepticism, or its cognates, skeptical, or the skeptic, and so forth. Which register, Cartesian or Kantian, a philosopher is operating in will determine what it is for someone to be a skeptic in this area of philosophy, what it is for something to be a skeptical paradox, what its form will be, and so forth. But now I want to go on and say this is not just true for the word skepticism and its cognates, but it's true for a great deal of what I will call philosophical terminology, philosophical vocabulary. That the logic of the vocabulary, what it's doing and how it works, depends upon the register of the problematic. And Cartesian and Kantian problematics are the two registers I've acquainted you with in my first two lectures. If we had more time, I would go through more varieties of skepticism, and the point would be the same in structure, but it would become more complicated. But the first thing is to see that there's an important thing to notice here, that philosophical terminology is not the kind of thing that has a fixed definition, that you can be sure what you're doing with such words by looking them up in something called the Italian Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or whatever I know. You look up the word skepticism, or you look up some philosophical term, and now you know what the philosopher is doing with it. It's an illusion to think that an encyclopedia of philosophy can help you understand a philosopher in that way. To see how the philosophical terminology works, you have to understand the philosopher first. And in particular, I think there's huge differences that are induced on philosophical terminology depending upon the structure of the problematic. So, just equipped with the overview from the last 2 days of Cartesian and Kantian features, especially the features I gave you yesterday, the 9 features of each, I think it becomes possible. First, let's take 20th century analytic philosophy, to survey the history of 20th century analytic philosophy, and to notice that philosophers, in their discussions of what they call skepticism, often tend to be preoccupied with one register to the exclusion of the other. I think some of the most famous examples of what we might call the most distinguished members of the Cartesian branch of the analytic tradition would include G. E. Moore, Bertrand Russell, C.D. Broad, A.J. Ayer, H.H. Price, Roderick Chisholm, and so forth. We can make a very long list. But there's also a branch of the analytic tradition that, though it has fewer members, is, I think, very interesting. It's equally as distinguished, but easily misunderstood if read too closely and connected with the other tradition. And that's what I would call the Kantian branch of the analytic tradition. That is a branch that's concerned in the first instance, not exclusively, but in the first instance, with the Kantian problematic. I think perhaps some of the most interesting people in that tradition are C.I. Lewis, Peter Strawson, Wilfrid Sellars. More contemporary names would include Robert Branham, John McDowell. I'm not saying these philosophers agree with each other, or that they aren't very different. I'm saying the structure of the problematic they're working in, for all their differences, is Kantian, not the Cartesian problematic of these other philosophers. And I think the beginnings of the Cartesian problematic in the analytic tradition go back to Frege and the Tractatus. But then this is covered up in their reception by a Cartesian mainstream. And so what I mean when I say that there are these two different traditions in the analytic tradition, the Cartesian and the Kantian, is that if you examine how a great deal of philosophical vocabulary works, I gave you yesterday some examples in the discussion of what I mean by philosophical vocabulary, words like experience, epistemic, object, the given, consciousness, data, presentation, awareness, and so on. Those are just words that especially come up in philosophy of perception. If we were talking about philosophy of action, we would have to have another vocabulary. Movement, intention, and so forth. But if you look at how this vocabulary is employed, you'll notice that it requires a very different inflection. A different logic is induced in the relationship of the terms to each other. If you're looking at the writings of one of these sets of authors, the ones that are working within a Cartesian register, as opposed to the other set of authors. So, a preoccupation with... Okay, so now I was just talking about the analytic tradition. I'll do this more briefly, but I think everything I just said could also be said about the continental tradition. So, this is not a difference between the traditions. In particular, it brings out a deep affinity between the traditions, and it brings out points of affinity across the traditions that sometimes I think are more interesting than which tradition someone's in. That is analytic continental. So, for instance, I think, to take a particularly clear example, I think Heidegger is working within a Kantian problematic. And there's much in Heidegger that's much closer to Sellars than I think many figures who think they are Heideggerians in the continental tradition, but are re-Cartesianizing Heidegger's problems. So thus armed with this distinction between these two varieties of skepticism, I think you can notice points of affinity and divergence across the supposed divide between analytic and continental philosophy. And I think this classification, philosophically provides a much less superficial category for sorting philosophers into groups. It doesn't become about who they've read or who their professors were or what style they write in or what language they write in and so forth. But it becomes something about the shape of the philosophical problems themselves. So I think one can see past various common philosophical reference points that come from commonality of education and language and national and cultural tradition to see very fundamental divergences within each of these traditions and to notice very fundamental affinities between thinkers from different traditions, as I was saying a moment ago, between Heidegger and Sellars, for example, or Sartre and Price, for instance. Now, so far I've just been talking about words, consciousness, the given, skepticism. But what I really think is not only individual bits of vocabulary, and this is where it becomes more complicated, but whole phrases, clauses, sentences, questions acquire a different philosophical valence, depending upon whether they occur in the context of an investigation of a Cartesian or a Kantian problematic. So I'll give you an example we'll discuss later in the lecture. I'll just mention it now. It's a real example. Consider the following question. This is a quote from John McDowell. It's also a quote from Hilary Putnam. So the question is, can our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves? Some English words expressing a question. Can our cognitive powers, Kant might have said, our Erkenntnisfähigkeiten, our Erkenntnisvermögen, can they reach all the way to the objects themselves? And this question about what we mean by cognitive powers, what do we mean by reach? What kind of contact do we want? What kind of relation? What do we mean by the objects themselves? But it's the same words. Can the powers reach all the way to the objects themselves? McDowell answers this question, yes. Putnam says, I agree with McDowell. The answer to this question is yes. And they each take this to be a fundamental point of agreement to them, that they're answering this question the same way. But part of the assumption in this exchange is that this question is not just the same words, but is expressing the same philosophical concern. So in saying yes, they're saying yes to the same thing. So what I want to show you a little while, but I'll just mention this example as a preliminary example, and then we'll take a slightly more complicated example, and then we'll return to this one. What I want to show you is that this question, can our cognitive powers, if I had a board, I would write it down, the words, can our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves? Quotation marks. Words on the board. And then we want to ask about these words on the board. What do they say? What do they ask? Well, I think they can express what I would call a Cartesian anxiety. They can express a Cartesian anxiety about the existence of a gap between our representations of outer objects and those outer objects themselves. So if this question expresses Cartesian anxiety, the anxiety here is that our cognitive powers always operate in an awkward remove from the objects they represent. The Cartesian worry is that where our representations are here, the objects are over there, there's a gap in between. Our representations themselves seem to be tertia, something that mediates and gets in the way of us and the objects, that screens us. This is partly why Descartes needs help from God. God can see the representations directly. He can see the objects directly. He can see if they match. But those same words on my imaginary blackboard here, they can also express a Kantian anxiety In this case, the anxiety is about our capacity to direct our thought at objects. So even if I want to say, there is no elephant in this room, or if I want to claim, there is an elephant in this room, either way, I'm directing my thought at this room. Or let's take a room that's not even here. I want to say, my mother is in New York right now. It's the fact that my mother is in New York, and that New York is very far away, doesn't mean that it's harder to think about my mother than it is about there being no elephant. I have to take my thought and throw it all the way to New York. No. It's exactly the same capacity to say my mother is not in this room and my mother is in New York. The distance between me and New York is not a distance that matters now. It's not about a remove. It's about the capacity of my thought to be intentionally directed. True thoughts and false thoughts. And so when the Kantian asks, can our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves? The Kantian's question is, can our thought have that kind of intentional directedness? Is it so much as possible? So the Kantian anxiety here is that our so-called cognitive powers are unable to furnish us with anything that even amounts to a representation. It's not that some representations are true and some false, and it's hard to tell which ones are true because there's an indirection in the relationship between us and the object. The problem is, how is representation so much as possible? Can our thought have the capacity to represent? But these same words, these same forms of words, the words of my blackboard, can, on a particular occasion, in a particular philosopher's writings, express either a Cartesian or a Kantian word. This is a very simple example of how, at the level of the sentence, there can be this unclarity, or the question. So that means it becomes possible, and I will show you this in a moment when we compare Putnam and McDowell. It becomes possible for two philosophers to take themselves to be in agreement with one another when they're not. Or, and I'll give you an example of this at the end of today's lecture, for two philosophers to take themselves to be in disagreement with one another when they're not. It thus becomes very important when seeking to identify the sort of philosophical problematic in which a philosopher is entangled, to look beyond the most superficial features of his work, such as the forms of words that he's drawn to employ when framing his question. The two philosophers think they agree with McDowell, or the two philosophers think they're Kantian, according to me, tells you nothing about how close or far they are. At least on the schema I'm offering here, which I think gives you very fundamental divisions between philosophers. Two philosophers can both say they're Kantian, both agree with the same sentences of Kant, and be in profound disagreement with each other. Because one of them understands those sentences of Kant to be operating what I'm calling a Cartesian register, whereas another one understands them to be operating what I'm thinking of as a properly Kantian register. And similarly, just for analytic philosophers who are not interested in Kant at all, but are just trying to talk to each other. So we have to look beyond the superficial features of the philosopher's work and beyond their own self-understanding of who they agree with and who they don't agree with. And we have to look not just at the forms of words which they're drawn to employ when framing their problem, but the structure of the problematic that confers a sense upon those forms of words. So Wittgenstein's famous for saying, we have to look to the context of use to understand the meaning. Now I'm making a point that's related to Wittgenstein's point, but he never explicitly makes, but I think it's very important to his practice. If you understand the character of a philosopher's worry, you have to look at the kind of philosophical use he makes of words. That's not to say his question is necessarily a good one. Wittgenstein might think this philosopher is completely confused, and this philosopher is confused, but they have a different confusion. You can't even individuate. It's not just that you can't individuate meanings without use. You can't even individuate confusions without looking at what the philosopher is doing with his words. So that's connected to the answer I gave you yesterday about uncertainty. Wittgenstein's concerned to distinguish more than one kind of problem that is called skepticism. And this is something I think Mari McGinn misses. So you have to look at the features. I mean, the simplest way to do this is to take the features I gave you yesterday. I'm trying to operationalize and make it easy. Take those 9 features and look at the features that characterize the problematic. I think you'll find Putnam's problematic is characterized by the first 9 features, and the McDowell's by the second 9 features. And that tells you that although they're asking and answering the same question in the same way, that is, the same words on the board, in another sense, they're not asking or answering the same question at all. Now, even if you combine, let's just take one feature. I mean, to do this for all 9 features would take a few hours. But let's just take the first feature yesterday. The feature about, in the Cartesian case, it was the sort of example we need, that it be a best case. In the Kantian case, it has to do with the way the problematic, as I put it, homogenizes the field of examples. And so if you just take that first feature, and in your survey of varieties of skepticism, that is, in your survey of kinds of philosophical problematic that philosophers are discussing, across these areas, perception, action, mind, if you just look at that first feature, that is, if you note the character of the examples and how and whether they matter, I think that alone, just using that first feature, will be enough for you to already begin to notice that Price and Ayer and Austin are working in a common problematic, and that it's somehow a very different tradition of thought about skepticism from the one that runs through the writings of Heidegger and Lewis and Sellers. And if you don't understand, as it were, the integrity of each of these problematics, then if you belong to the first tradition, you'll think, the examples are no good, they need more detailed examples. And if you work in the second tradition and you don't understand the integrity of the first, you'll think, they're so hung up with, the difference between its being just a tomato and its being, a San Marzano tomato. But this difference doesn't matter at all. If I can't think about things, I can't think about either kind of tomato. So there's much misunderstanding, I think, that comes, and you can just using the first feature, I think you can very quickly notice that something different is going on. I think it's a little dangerous to just rely on the first feature. That would be a little superficial. I think you should look for a number of features. But already the first feature is quite a reliable telltale sign. So now I want to show you this in a little more detail. So I give you the first 2 quotations on pages 5 and 6, as I said. These are from Price and Lewis, H. Price and C.I. Lewis. And I picked them because I think they're particularly nice examples of 2 paragraphs which, if you read them superficially, you might have the impression this is the same philosophical issue. And I'm trying to teach you to read them in such a way that you see it's a very different philosophical issue. So let's first bring out how they seem to be the same. Well, they're both in books that are very concerned with philosophy of perception. Price's book is called Perception. They're both essentially from the first pages of the first chapter of the book. Price's chapter is really the first chapter. Lewis's book actually has a first chapter on the method of philosophy, which is very general. So it's the second chapter, but it's the first one where he gets down to business and starts. So as soon as they get down to business, you find this paragraph in each of them. The chapters they're from in these 2 books both have the same title. First chapter of Price's book is called The Given. The chapter in Lewis's book that I've taken this from is called The Given. So I'm trying as hard as possible to pick 2 things that, based on superficial criteria, ought to be a match. And they both investigate the given through an example. In Price's case, it's a tomato. In Lewis's case, it's a fountain pen. But if you read more closely these 2 passages, I was hoping that you might do this, as I said in the bathroom yesterday. I don't know if you did. Then certain issues come up. Let's first notice some more things we can say about these 2 passages if you've read them. One of the things you can say about Price's tomato, I think you can say with equal justice about Lewis's fountain pen. That is, when Price says, "When I see a tomato," that has the force of whenever I see any object. And that's also true of Lewis's fountain pen. Their examples are supposed to be in some way representative of our perceptual relation to objects. But the question is how? Another thing you can say of Price's tomato, I don't think it would be right to say about Lewis's fountain pen. The entire existence of the world is squeezed into Price's tomato. Price thinks if we can't prove to ourselves somehow that this tomato exists, then we cannot prove that the external world exists. The problem here is one of existence. Does the external world really exist? It has to do with what I called the being in the first lecture of that which is represented. Those are all marks. Existence, really, being, so forth. These are all marks that's the first question. Not the eventual question, but the first question of a Cartesian problematic. So Price's tomato and Lewis's fountain pen each aspire in some way to be representative of the object of knowledge as such. But the examples aspire, we might put it this way, it's a little misleading, but let me put it this way. They each aspire to a sort of generality, but not the same sort of generality. Price's tomato seeks to represent, and this is to say it's Cartesian example. Price's tomato seeks to represent the object of knowledge in virtue of its alleged optimality. What Price's tomato is supposed to be, we can put in terms of the first lecture by saying it's supposed to be a best case of knowledge. Everyone knows what tomatoes are. There might be experts about whether it's a San Marzano tomato, but a tomato? Every child knows what a tomato is. It's in plain view. It's perfectly well lit. It's only a few inches, not too close, but optimal distance from my eyes. The whole point of the example is to construct an optimal case for epistemic relatedness. In virtue of the supposition that if knowledge fails here, at least knowledge of this sort, sensory knowledge will fail everywhere, and if we can show how we can have such knowledge here, we can show that knowledge by means of the senses is possible. There are some actual cases. So it's selected as the best case of knowledge, and the point of rolling it onto the scene is to see whether and what in one's experience of it is susceptible to doubt, and what the consequences of such doubt are. And even in this short passage, you see Price immediately getting down to Cartesian business. He's saying, what can I doubt, what can't I doubt? There's something red in my field of consciousness, this I cannot doubt. That it's a three-dimensional extended object that exists outside my mind, that I can doubt. And he goes back and forth. What kinds of things can I doubt, what can't I doubt? This is the Cartesian problematic up and running and trying to sift things into the two different forms of elements that are on one side of a Cartesian gap and the other side of a Cartesian gap. So the capacity of the tomato for representativeness here turns on its being, first of all, notice, a fully determinate instance of knowledge. Its representativeness is a function of the way it allows us to infer something about knowledge in general from a consideration of this particular case. And so as I was saying, if you look at people like Austin, many people are critical of the Cartesian tradition like this. Deeper investigations in the Cartesian paradox often probe whether there's a tension in the Cartesian's characterization of the example. For instance, in his desire to furnish an example of knowledge that's supposed to be at one and the same time fully representative of knowledge, and yet a fully determinate knowledge claim. Can you do both these things at once? That's part of the immanent critique of the Cartesian tradition. And it's interesting. I'm not criticizing at all. I'm merely locating the problematic in which it belongs. Lewis's fountain pen is a very different matter. What Lewis does when he has his fountain pen, pretend this is a fountain pen. Notice he doesn't say pen, he can say fountain pen. Some people might know better than others what fountain pens are, but it doesn't matter because we're now involved in a Kantian investigation. So he says fountain pen. And what he does is not ask, what can I doubt and what can't I doubt? What Lewis is concerned with is what different kind of capacities are in play here. the sensibility must be in play. Something must be given to me. That is to say, there must be some capacity of receptivity involved. But it's represented a certain kind of way. What is given to me is represented as fountain pen. So concepts are involved. Fountain pen is a concept I have learned. And these two capacities must be working together if I am to see this as fountain pen. And then what Lewis starts doing is he imagines alternatives. But the alternatives he imagines are very different from the Cartesians. The Cartesian, if he's got his tomato, switch to tomato, wants to say, but I might be dreaming. If I were dreaming, how would things appear that appear the same? Take out the tomato, put back the fountain pen. We have Lewis. Lewis is concerned with alternatives, but the alternatives are doing a very different work. Lewis says, let's consider Clarence Irving Lewis as a little baby who hasn't learned language yet. That's one possibility. Also concern an adult who is, he says, a savage from New Guinea. So he belongs to a pre-linguistic hunter-gatherer tribe. Second example. Third example, consider the grown-up professor of philosophy at Harvard, Professor Clarence Irving Lewis, looking. And let's imagine, as near as possible, they're all looking at the same thing. There's a sense in which their experience is completely different. The baby looking at this will see something, he suggests perhaps, that's smooth and biteable. He will not bring it under the concept fountain pen. He hasn't learned the concept fountain pen. He doesn't even know how to write. The connection between this object and activities like writing and reading and so forth are not conceptual connections that are available to the baby. What's available to the baby is, a perception of this object that he might put in his mouth, for instance. Its shape is, for instance, salient. Whether the baby is bringing under concepts or not depends exactly on how old the baby is. But even if the baby is bringing under, or the child, but even if he's bringing under concepts, the experience is fundamentally different. If it's a savage from New Guinea, he thinks what will strike him, say we fly a helicopter over the jungles of West Irian and we drop a fountain pen, nice bright shiny fountain pen into the jungle. He comes upon it. He'll probably freeze. He'll be afraid of it. His whole experience to it will be different. Insofar as he brings in her concepts, the first concepts are going to be something like not a natural object. It didn't just grow out of the ground the way the grass did. Maybe it's man-made artifact. Maybe it's sent by the gods. It's very smooth and shiny. It's not like anything anybody in our tribe has made. So what Lewis wants to bring out is the experience, in one way, has different character, which shows how concepts shape the experience differently. In another way, what he wants to do is arrive at a notion of the given. So he's trying to help us abstract the idea that there's a certain sensuous quality, so something universal, but not conceptual, that is shared across the baby's experience and the professor's experience and the savage's experience. And so he's trying to elucidate the notion of given as something that has a kind of universality in terms of sensual quality, but has to be distinguished from conceptuality, and the experiences themselves are fundamentally different. There's no common factor. Apperceptively, in the experiences are differently, but transcendentally, we can see there is something qualitatively sensuous that must be the same. And this is all part of his Kantian investigation, to begin to explain how thought can be of the world in the Kantian sense. I could go into much more detail, but what I want you to see is if you read the examples carefully, they're doing totally different things. And what the word given means is something completely different, that's arrived at in a different way. What object here means, the object as such, even what consciousness means, are all quite different and carved up in a different way. We could talk about this in more detail. So we might say Lewis's fountain pen seeks to represent the object of knowledge as such in virtue of seeking general characteristics which any instance of thought about experience must possess. Any experience that has empirical content, which is a condition of knowledge. But it's shared by true and false thoughts. So the supposition here is that all of our cognitive faculties must possess a common structure, And we can only understand the particular exercise of our cognitive faculties, which is empirical knowledge through perception, once we've understood the structure. So Lewis's fountain pen is not selected as a best case of knowledge, but as a coherent candidate for the kind of thing that could be true or false. So it could be a candidate for knowledge, even if we don't know it. It's not offered as an exemplary instance, the way in which Price's tomato is, but as a run-of-the-mill specimen of the sort of thing that can figure in a claim to knowledge. So what's at issue for Lewis, for instance, is not the unimpeachable certainty of his relation to this. Lewis is very concerned with what can I doubt, what can't I doubt. You don't find this. And Price is very concerned. What can I doubt, what can I? He's a Cartesian. Lewis is not concerned with concepts of doubt and certainty in the first instance, but rather the bare intelligibility of that which his experience presents him. And I'm suggesting that Lewis, though he's a sort of clear, sort of straightforward writing, mid-century American version of such a philosopher, is nonetheless a typical Kantian in this respect. Lewis's example's capacity for representativeness turns on its being susceptible not to a certain sort of doubt, but to a certain sort of abstraction. The baby, the professor, the savage in New Guinea, all of these must have some dimension of that which is sensuously given to them, even if only terms they can describe it in are different. So there's no common describable content. But there's something we can abstract that he thinks must be in common, and he thinks is the beginning of the answer to the Kantian question. And this is a form of example to which any determinate case of knowledge can be subjected. But notice what we have once we perform the abstraction, and we talk about this sensuous quality, is itself something indeterminate. It cannot be characterized. The given is the name for an aspect of knowledge which, as such, is indeterminate. The given, in a Cartesian example, is a fully determined example of knowledge. It's supposed to have all the characteristics of knowledge. It's just better than an ordinary one. So there's very different conceptions of what you mean by the object given. So in Lewis's case, the representativeness of the object is a function in a way in which conclusions about this particular example flow from a consideration of what must be constitutive of knowledge in general. That is, the relation between what you conclude about this and knowledge in general flows in the opposite direction from the Cartesian. Price sees something about this case, he draws a conclusion about all knowledge. Lewis reflects what must be the case in order for us to have knowledge, which allows us to transcendentally infer something about what must be true of our experience, in common with other experiences, even though it's not something we can observe. So, for instance, many of the deeper investigations into the Kantian paradox will probe whether these conditions, like the sensible and the intellectual conditions that Kantians think must be constitutive of knowledge, can be conceived in the way that they are. Are they co-satisfiable? How independent are they? How mutually entwined are they? These are the kinds of issues that get people preoccupied in the Kantian tradition. It's part of why I think Merleau-Ponty, in his later work, clearly belongs to this tradition, because he's exactly concerned about this kind of question. So, the existence of the world, I hope it's now clear, is not at stake in Lewis's example of an object, but the possibility of its schematizability, its availability to thought is. The point of the example is not to inquire whether we know there's a fountain pen here, but how we are able to apprehend a colligation of sense qualities as fountain pen, even falsely. So the point of Lewis's fountain pen is to present something. And so notice his object does not have to be generic, the way the Cartesian says. It can be more or less specific or generic. To present something which involves the interplay of these various faculties that he thinks are a condition of knowledge. The point of Lewis's exploration of the example is not to see what will and will not withstand doubt, but to isolate the elements of knowledge that are conditions of the possibility of cognition, of relatedness to an object as such. Okay, other things I could say, but I'll skip it all. Now let me just say something about what I've been saying that's a little misleading. I've been speaking so far about Price's sort of object, or Price's sort of example, and Lewis's sort of object, and Lewis's sort of example. And there's something very potentially misleading about that way of speaking. So far, just to make things clear, I've sort of had different objects as the example. Price has a tomato. Lewis has a fountain pen. But I hope it's clear. Either of them could talk about a tomato in their example. But what the role of the tomato would be is completely different. So it's not that there are two kinds of objects, the kinds of objects the Cartesian focus on, and the kinds of objects the Kantian focus on. That's not what's at issue here. It's not what philosophers usually mean if they talk about kinds of objects in the spirit of doing ontology. Lewis could have chosen a tomato, could have chosen a goldfinch. Instead of speaking of Lewis's sort of example, I think it would be much better to speak of something like Lewis's or the Kantians' manner of taking up the example. And I might say that I think this is a point, because it came up in a discussion earlier, I think this is also important for Cavell, even when he's talking about the Cartesian context. People have read Cavell as if the difference between generic and specific object were differences between kinds of object. But Cavell there, too, is also very clear, I think, that those terms should be taken, not to be taken to mean there are two kinds of objects in the world. But as Cavell puts it, they're supposed to characterize the spirit, this is, quote, the spirit in which an object is under discussion, the kind of problem that has arisen about it, the problem in which it presents itself as a focus of discussion. That's his own explanation of what he means. And that point about his terminology for the Cartesian object is also true for my terminology about the Kantian object. So we might say the object at the focus of the Cartesian problematic, I will now let myself call it, and I hope you won't be confused then, the Cartesian object, and it's in a certain sense different from the focus of the object in the Kantian problem. Call it the Kantian object, even if we use the same word, tomato, to characterize both. And this is not because there are two kinds of things in the world, ontologically. Rather, the point is to characterize the different ways in which the problematic itself is structured. And therefore, attention is itself directed at that which we are talking about. Which is why even the very bare word object of experience, object of knowledge, that philosophical terminology is actually functioning differently. So I'm trying to make this about a very simple word, object, the object of knowledge. Even that term in philosophy can have very different function in these different problematics. So we could sum this up, if it doesn't confuse you, by saying the Kantian object is not to be confused with the Cartesian object. And that doesn't mean that the Cartesian is an object which, due to its unusual properties, does not fall under the genus Kantian object. You can't, Aristotelian categories will not help you here. Rather, what it means is the sort of concept of an object that's at issue in each of these skeptical problematics, and the sort of generality and the sort of representativeness that attaches to each is different in its logic. Okay, now I've just made this point now for the word object, and I think implicitly I made it for a few other words like the given. But I could go on for many more instances of philosophical terminology and I think show you the same point, that what these words are doing, and therefore the whole questions and sentences in which they figure, have a very different sense depending upon the problematic. I'm going to ask you to trust me on that. And I'll move on to, very briefly, to the second form of insight. And I'll do this very fast because it's come up in discussion already. And so I won't repeat myself. And then I'll move on to, I think, the more interesting last form of insight. But the second form of insight comes when you then ask yourself the question, once you know these problematics are very different, you notice that even what's happening with the philosophical vocabulary and the senses of whole sentences are different. Then you're really in a position to ask this question and understand what you're asking and be interested in it. And here's the question. What is the relation between these problematics? So this is the topic I mentioned at the beginning of my first lecture. Is there merely a nominal unity? I originally asked about what we call skepticism. But now you notice this question has become much more general. Is there merely a nominal unity in the way philosophers employ a great deal of philosophical terminology? Or is there some more fundamental underlying unity that is the cause of the fact that the same words are, say, in Lewis and Price, even though it leads to so much misunderstanding? And I think that is a very useful question to ask. Even if we disagree about our answers about it, it's a very fundamental question that takes you a long way. One thing that you can do with that question is you can look at interesting philosophers and ask, what is their answer to that question? What does Kant, or Hegel, or Heidegger, or Merleau-Ponty, or Wittgenstein, or so forth think about that question? Now, some philosophers will have no view about that question, because it's not just they won't have my vocabulary, they'll have no sense of this distinction. But I think it's true of a number of very interesting philosophers. At some level or other, they are aware of the differences between these problematics. But then what they think about the relation between them is something about which they differ. So this came up in our discussion. I suggested that Kant and Wittgenstein are alike in one way and different in another way. That McDowell is very close to Kant in his answer to this question, not just in being in the Kantian problematic, but in having Kant's answer about the understanding of the question, what's the relationship between the Kantian problematic and Cartesian problem? That's a much further thing. That's something about which very few philosophers are in agreement. What I mean by the word Kantian is something much milder than that. But there's Kant's understanding of the relationship between his problematic and our problems. I think McDowell is very close to Kant there. I think Cavell is very far, but very close to Wittgenstein on the point. So this is something we talked about. But so I think various forms of insight can come from pursuing this question. One form of insight I mentioned at the end of the first lecture in our discussion was, I think you can see very interesting affinities between Kant and Wittgenstein, of a sort that are much more informative than the way that people usually try to compare Kant and Wittgenstein, which sort of involves getting everything out of focus so you can say the same thing about them. So I think there's much that can come from pursuing that, which we can take up in discussion. But instead, for the rest of my lecture today, I will talk about another form of insight I think can come from these taxonomies. That is the form of insight that allows you to see more clearly some of the ways in which philosophers are not communicating with each other. It looks like they're communicating, but they're not. And I want to give you some examples of this. And very quickly, I'll give you 3 examples. And the examples are constructed to bring out some points. So each of the examples involves a pair of philosophers. First example, the pair will be Putnam and McDowell. The second example, the pair will be Kripke and Cavell. And the third example, one member from each of the previous pairs comes back, and we will look at Cavell and McDowell. By looking at these 3 pairs, I think we can see certain things about the complexity of these issues. So let's start with the first pair, Putnam and McDowell. And now Putnam is somebody who's written a lot of things and changes his mind very often. So I think it'll help if I fix which Putnam I'm talking about. And I'm going to be talking about his Dewey lectures, which are one of the more influential things he's written in the last 20 years. And there, what he wants to do is he wants to trace many of the problems in contemporary philosophy, especially in philosophy of perception, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, to a widespread assumption. So the key is to identify the widespread assumption that's caused all this trouble. And he says the widespread assumption that's caused all this trouble is what he calls the interface conception in the Dewey lectures. And he says it continues, has been responsible for these problems since Descartes and early modern philosophy, and continues to be responsible for these difficulties today that plague contemporary philosophy. And he characterizes the consequences of falling prey to this interface conception as nothing short of a disaster. We have a quotation from Putnam on the handout in this connection. This is quotation 4. Maybe I'll skip the first 3 words of that quotation for a moment. He says, the key assumption responsible for the disaster is the idea that there's been an interface between our cognitive powers and the external worlds. Or to put the same point differently, and now we have my phrase, the idea that our cognitive powers cannot reach all the way to the objects themselves. So now we find these words on the page in Putnam. So he uses that phrase that we investigated earlier in today's lecture to characterize the crucial assumption. But notice he also begins it by saying, in McDowell's view. So he takes himself to be agreeing with McDowell about this. So he's both offering a diagnosis of the philosophical problems of our time, which he characterizes a certain way, and expressing a point of agreement with McDowell. And what I will argue briefly is he cannot have both those things at once. If he agrees with McDowell, then his diagnosis is wrong. If his diagnosis is right, he's actually in deep disagreement with McDowell. I'm not saying who's right. I'm merely pointing out there's a problem about what you're talking about. If you take there to be a kind of determinacy of sense that goes with phrases like this without appropriately attending to the structure of the problematic. And in particular, what I want to argue is that what happens in Putnam's book is that a great deal of the vocabulary, including a sentence like this, hovers on the page of Putnam's Dewey lecture. It hovers between two different sorts of philosophical problematics, a Cartesian one and a Kantian one, where he's talking more closely about Wittgenstein or McDowell or Kant. In order to have what he says fit what they say, the structure, the problematic itself, starts to take on a Kantian shape. In order to say what he really wants to say about this, which is the fundamental problem, is the interface conception, which is basically to say that the mistake is to assume there's a Cartesian gap. There's something that must become between me and the object the way a Cartesian thought does. Is to push the vocabulary and the sense of the sentences in which it occurs in the direction of a Cartesian register. So I'm suggesting that in order to see how McDowell misreads Putnam, we need to see how he can be misrepresenting his thought while completely faithfully paraphrasing him and quoting him. I think this is a deep point about philosophy. I think in philosophy, like no other subject, you can completely misrepresent somebody while at a certain level being completely faithful in your paraphrase of them. You can't do that in mathematics. If I reproduce your proof perfectly, my proof is a proof. I might not understand it, but the level of what I say, there's no problem. Whereas in philosophy, the terminology itself depends so much on the structure of our background understanding of the problematic that we can parachute down lots and lots of material from the philosopher we're writing about and expressing our admiration of Kant, Hegel, Wittgenstein, in this case, Putnam about McDowell, and change everything. So we need to see how Putnam's employment of stretches of philosophical prose which he lifts quite directly from McDowell's pages, that his transplantation maneuver does not leave the sense of that prose unchanged. By transplanting McDowell's sentences into the context of his attack on the interface conception as the key assumption that produced the disaster, Putnam confers a sense upon McDowell's sentences different from the one which I want to say they originally were supposed to have in McDowell's own investigations. So, as the context in which a bit of prose of McDowell's, like our cognitive powers can reach all the way to the objects themselves, some bit of McDowell's prose, what happens to it as it moves from McDowell's pages to Putnam's pages, I want to suggest, is very much like what happens when this philosophical vocabulary that we find in Price's paragraph moves to Lewis's paragraph. We have a similar kind of shift in the sense. The Price and the Lewis example is very neat. To do this with Putnam and McDowell, I can't give you two paragraphs that stand next to each other that seem at every level to be saying the same thing, and then you see they're not. It's a much more complicated investigation. But the point I want to suggest is the same. Let me just bring this out quickly, and then I'll give you two more examples. So, McDowell's book has as one of its aims to make room for what he calls a truism. And he quotes Wittgenstein here in order to bring out the truism that he's trying to make room for again, that he thinks philosophy makes difficult. to accommodate. And so he has a quotation from Wittgenstein, which brings this out. It's quotation 5 on your handout. Wittgenstein says, section 95 of the Investigations, when we say and mean that such and such is the case, we, in our meaning, does not stop anywhere short of the fact. That quotation of Wittgenstein's is connected with what McDowell's concerned about when he talks about our cognitive powers reaching all the way. Now, in a way, if you're just reading quickly, you might think that's a lot like things Putnam wants to say. And Putnam wants to say, right? We saw him say it in the previous quotation. Our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves. But in affirming what he's affirming, what Putnam's affirming, he's not trying to make room for a truism of the Wittgensteinian sort. He wants the truth of that itself to be a refutation of the Cartesian skeptic. He's asking this to become a thought that figures in a confrontation with skepticism in a very different way, and a different sort of skepticism. So in affirming this, well, I'm going to skip that. Notice one other thing about this quotation 5. On the surface, what Wittgenstein's concerned with here is not whether we know something, but rather this passage is concerned with the possibility of meaning, with the possibility of being able to mean something. My mother's in New York. My mother's not in New York. Wherever my mother is right now, either one of those sentences would be perfectly good examples, I think, of what Wittgenstein's talking about here, which is my words, capacity to say something true or false about my mother, wherever she is. So the focus here in the first instance is on meaning, the conditions of thought having a sense, not on the possibility of knowledge. Knowledge is ultimately a concern for McDowell and Kant, but it must go through such an investigation first. We don't attack the topic of knowledge directly first. Putnam expresses the thought he wants to vindicate in his lectures. This is quotation 6, this is the beginning of his lectures. He wants to say, there's a way to do justice to our sense that knowledge claims are responsible to reality without recourse into metaphysical fantasy. From McDowell's point of view, the focus on knowledge claims as the paradigm for responsibility to reality has to count as at best misleading and at worst misguided. For it invites a misidentification of the strand of philosophy that McDowell is concerned to treat. That is, it invites a substitution of a Cartesian problematic for a Kantian one. McDowell, of course, doesn't want to deny that in the end we should be able to see knowledge claims as responsible to reality, but he does want to insist, through most of his book, that for the purposes of the investigation of that book, Mind and World, knowledge claims constitute only a special case of a more general, I would say now Kantian, problematic, which, as I put it yesterday, concerns the possibility of the vulnerability of any claim to how things are. So this sort of vulnerability to reality under investigation in McDowell is exhibited in false claims equally well as in true ones. The kind of vulnerability to reality at issue in that investigation figures equally in our capacity for thinking and even dreaming as in our capacities for knowing, actually seeing. So McDowell's investigation does not single out those of our claims which are knowledgeable, because it's concerned with what must be the case for any sort of human intellectual activity to be intelligible as claim making. It's the possibility of making claims in general, not knowledge claims in particular, that comes to seem at risk. If Wittgenstein's truism is at risk, if there's a problem about being able to mean my mother's in New York, then I do lose the ability to know my mother's in New York. But I also lose the ability to falsely believe my mother's in New York. So that's just a very quick way of bringing out the distance. Now, in fact, I think this is connected to much deeper differences between Putnam and McDowell. And I will just summarize these briefly, and then we will move on. It has to do with their larger project. Putnam in the Dewey, if you're reading, well, let me put it from McDowell's point of view. If you're reading Putnam and you're McDowell, you're going to have the following four worries. Well, first, Putnam is conflating Cartesian and Kantian varieties of the problematic that's at issue. Two, the problematic that, if you're McDowell, you'll think is increasingly pressing in contemporary philosophy is the Kantian one. If you want to be talking about these issues that, for instance, in the long quotation 7, you see Putnam talking about how does language hook onto the world, you won't understand what that problem in Crispin Wright and Kripke and Brandon and so forth is unless you see that it has a Kantian shape. 3, the difficulties to which that problematic gives rise cannot be made to vanish by exposing what's dubious in the assumptions of the Cartesian skeptic. Those people will think, I'm not a Cartesian. Why are you telling me that? 4, a satisfying treatment of Cartesian skepticism, if you're McDowell, you think, itself requires that we think through what's confused in Kantian skepticism. So Putnam looks at contemporary philosophy, says there's all these problems. The root problem is Cartesian skepticism. If we get rid of the interface conception, we'll get rid of all of these problems. McDowell looks and he thinks, that's exactly wrong. The root problem is Kantian skepticism. We need to show how even the Cartesian problems are inchoate, inept expressions of the Kantian ones. If we bring what's wrong with Kantian skepticism, we will treat Cartesian skepticism too. So their fundamental conception of how to proceed in philosophy, what one needs to bring out, what the point at which one needs to attack, I think could not be more different. But they think they agree completely because they utter the same sentences. I'm not just saying there's little disagreement. They don't quite agree. I'm saying they're fundamentally opposed in their conception of philosophy. But they can miss this because Putnam will be happily saying, but I completely agree with you, McDowell, blah, blah, blah. And McDowell will go, I don't follow all of this, but I'm so happy you agree with me. So good, we agree. That's my first example. Second example. So that was an example of an apparent agreement. Now an example of an apparent disagreement. Cavell and Kripke. We talked about this a little bit yesterday in my answer to your question. So I'll do this a little more quickly. But I think it's useful, second example, to contrast with the first one. What you have in Kripke's book is someone presenting what he thinks is Wittgenstein's treatment of skepticism. A very central case of skepticism, what he thinks of as meaning skepticism, or skepticism about rules, skepticism about language. I think what Kripke's treating there fits into my taxonomy and what I called in my first lecture, the Kantian problem in philosophy of language. But when Cavell reads Kripke, he's unable to recognize the problematic that Kripke's discussing as one of skepticism at all. It's not something he would call skepticism. And for the same reason he thinks, so in one way he says, Kripke and I agree so much. Very gratified by Kripke's book. We both think skepticism is fundamental to Wittgenstein. We think that if you see the generality of his concern with skepticism, you see that this covers all of his philosophy. We see that these different parts of the book are connected by this one topic. So he goes on and on about how they agree at one level. And he's right. I think there is a deep agreement there, deeper than he realizes, actually, in a certain way, between him and Kripke. But at another level, he's completely confused. Because then when he looks in detail, it doesn't seem to even be skepticism. So there's this superficial agreement at the big level, which he thinks can't really be agreement. Now, just a caveat, in case I mislead something. I don't at all mean to express sympathy with any of Kripke's suggestions for how to understand Wittgenstein's response to what Kripke calls the rule-following paradox. Kripke's communitarian solution, his skeptical solution, I think is in no way a reading of Wittgenstein. But I think his reading, his understanding of what the problem is actually very deep and accurate, and was an important moment in reading Wittgenstein, really seeing how it's quite different from the structure of a Cartesian paradox. And as I said, the basic problem here is what was the problem we were discussing as our third Kantian variant in the first lecture. We can put it like this. How can a sequence of marks and noises so much as seem to mean something? That's the problem here. Now, as I said yesterday, I think what Cavell does, basically, is he says some correct things. He says, for instance, that what Kripke calls a skeptical solution is not anything Wittgenstein would count as a solution to a philosophical problem. And I think Cavell's right about that. But then Cavell moves very quickly from that observation to the conclusion that if Kripke's solution is not Wittgenstein, then the problem to which Kripke offers a solution is not quite Wittgenstein's either, unquote. And I just think that's a complete non sequitur. I don't think that's right. But as I was saying in my answer to you yesterday, I think all of the steps of his argument for that conclusion are fine except the conclusion. The basic, I think I give you a little epitome of that argument in quotation 8 on your handout. So in quotation 8 we have Cavell saying, Kripke reports that sometimes, contemplating the situation of discovery, that one may mean nothing at all. He has had something of an eerie feeling, and that the entire idea of meaning vanishes into thin air. This is what I was calling the Kantian boggle. Is this, I ask myself, Cavell says, like the feelings I have had under a skeptical surmise? I think he here means a Cartesian skeptical surmise, of the world vanishing, as it were, behind its appearances. We there have the structure of the Cartesian gap. It's not the vanishing of the phenomena, but the remove of the phenomena. Or myself vanishing, as it were, behind or inside my body. These feelings have been touchstones for me of skeptical paradox, of conclusions I cannot yet become compelled to believe. I would like to say that when the entire idea of meaning vanishes into thin air, what vanishes was already air, revealing no scene of destruction. I don't think Wittgenstein would disagree with that last part of my Wittgenstein, but I don't think that means what Cavell thinks it means. So what I want to say is what Cavell is doing here, and in the rest, I'm just giving you a little excerpt, but in much of the rest of this article on Kripke, is he's going through some of my Cartesian features. Here's a shorter list, but it's a good list. He's saying things like, this doesn't begin with the best case of knowledge. It doesn't issue in the right sort of discovery to which one's unable to accommodate oneself. The conclusions he draws do not generalize in accordance with, I would say, the Cartesian format. So I agree with everything almost that Cavell says in this article, in his descriptions of Kripke and how it doesn't fit what he calls skepticism. That is, I agree with everything Cavell has to say about this, except his conclusion. So I would say that I agree that the paradox of section 201 of the Investigations, where Wittgenstein says, this was our paradox. If anything can be made to accord with the rule, nothing can. I would agree with him that it's not a Cartesian paradox. But I wouldn't just therefore affirm it is not a skeptical paradox. It is a paradox that has the form of what I think Kant in the first instance called skepticism. And it is, I think, a paradox of the form that Wittgenstein calls skepticism, continuing to participate in this understanding of a kind of a thing, a kind of a shape that a skeptical problem can have. So we've had an apparent agreement with Putnam and McDowell, an apparent disagreement with Cavell and Kripke. In the apparent agreement, Putnam looked to be a Cartesian, McDowell looked to be a Kantian. In the apparent disagreement, where Cavell and Kripke seemed to be really disagreeing, Cavell was focused on the Cartesian case, Kripke on the Kantian case. I say apparent disagreement because I think I, who think Kripke is right about the form of the problem Wittgenstein's concerned with, can still agree with everything Cavell says about Cartesian skepticism. What Kripke is saying about the form of the rule-following talks doesn't threaten what Cavell cares about. But he thinks it's threatened because it's being called skepticism, but it doesn't fit what he calls skepticism. So I don't think there's actually a very important philosophical disagreement there. If it came to certain other issues, there might be one. But at that point, there's not yet a disagreement where he sees one. Now, I want to look at a second apparent disagreement between Cavell and McDowell, because I think this will help bring out how difficult the issues are. What will seem to be happening here is that Cavell and McDowell will seem to be switching roles. Cavell will now appear to be the Kantian, and McDowell will now appear to be the Cartesian. These are very good philosophers, I think. So if this can happen, this, I think, brings out something about the difficulty of the issues. So we have quotations from McDowell and Cavell in 9 and 10 on the handout. And they're concerned with a disagreement about criteria, how to understand what Wittgenstein means by criteria. And the case we're discussing here, as it happens, is the problem of other minds again, our second problem from the first day. And they do have just an exegetical disagreement about how the term criteria is supposed to function in Wittgenstein. So we have Matteo seeming for all the world if he's in pain. But actually Matteo is pretending to be in pain. That's our example. Now we want to bring Wittgenstein's concept of a criterion to bear on this example. McDowell will say, if Matteo is pretending to be in pain, but he's not really in pain, then the criteria for pain are only apparently satisfied. Cavell will say, that's quotation 9, summarized quickly. Cavell will say, in quotation 10, if Matteo is pretending to be in pain, then it's pain he's pretending to be in. And if what we see him to be in is a state in which he's pretending to be in pain, then the concept of pain is in play. And so the criteria for the application of that concept are satisfied. So in the case of someone pretending to be in pain, the criteria for pain or pain behavior are satisfied. So about the same example, McDowell says criteria for pain are only apparently satisfied. Cavell says they are satisfied. So there's some kind of disagreement. And there's a lot of literature about Cavell and McDowell saying who's right. But the literature assumes there's a deep philosophical issue about which they're right. Whereas I think actually in this area of philosophy, at least the things that at first instance are at issue in these pages they're writing about, there's very little disagreement between them. What's different is how they're using the concept of a criterion. One of them is using it in a Cartesian register. One of them is using it in a Kantian register. I think you can actually use that concept in either way. If what you want to say is that criteria are criteria for the existence of pain and so forth, then you should say what McDowell says. If what you want to say are criteria for the application of concepts, you should say what McDowell says. Those are two different ways of using the concept. It's not a philosophical disagreement. That's philosophers talking by each other because people are assuming they're using the concept in the same way and answering the same question differently. But they're actually asking different questions, answering those questions in their way, and I think they would each agree on the other's answer to his question. Now, there is an exegetical question here. How does Wittgenstein use the concept of criterion? And I think Cavell is right about that. But I think that can mislead one to actually how much fundamental agreement there is between McDowell and Cavell about the respective issues if you don't understand how the term itself is functioning in different registers. But now, notice what's happened. In Putnam's misencounter with McDowell, we saw McDowell wishing to privilege the Kantian problematic over the Cartesian one. In Cavell's misencounter with Kripke, we saw Cavell wanting to privilege the Cartesian problematic over the Kantian. So if you just relied on that evidence, then you might conclude something like this. McDowell is primarily concerned to explore the Kantian problematic, Cavell the Cartesian. If you ask, what do they mean by skepticism, first off, you'd be right. But this larger conclusion you might think follows. I don't think follows. I do think that Cavell and McDowell have, if you will, complementary blind spots in their reading of Wittgenstein. But I don't think the blind spots are as big as what I just said would make it seem. So when we look at this criteria dispute in these two quotations, the first thing I say we should notice is that they appear to disagree. They seem to be drawing different conclusions. Criteria satisfied, criteria not satisfied. But the second thing to notice is that their roles are reversed. McDowell is taking Wittgensteinian criteria to operate here at the Cartesian level. The question that they're supposed to settle, according to McDowell, if criteria are satisfied, is one concerning the truth of a claim, the existence of a pain, the reality of a phenomenon. The pain is really there. The question that's to be settled, according to Cavell, if criteria are satisfied, is not one concerning the truth of a claim, but one concerning its purport. Is he in pain? Is the appropriate question. That means criteria satisfied, regardless of what the answer is. Not one concerning the existence of something which falls under the concept, but the applicability of the concept. Not one concerning the reality of the phenomenon, but one concerning the schematizability of its phenomenon. What is it to see someone as in pain? And that capacity has to be brought in play, even to be able to see someone as pretending to be in pain. If you didn't have the one capacity, you wouldn't have the other. So, what interests me here is that their disagreement should have this structure. And so I think there's a sort of twofold irony that stems from this. The first irony is to be found in the fact that in most of his writing about Wittgenstein, McDowell reads Wittgenstein as concerned to take a Kantian approach to skepticism, to turn the Cartesian problems into Kantian problems and solve them in that form. And McDowell tends to see the Cartesian craving for epistemic indubitability or certainty, epistemic security, as I put it, and this is quoting something he says in his preface, as an intelligible though inept response to an inchoate form of philosophical anxiety that he thinks at bottom is a Kantian anxiety. Thus, despite his Cartesian construal of the grammar of the concept of a criterion, McDowell tends to see the treatment of philosophical skepticism as requiring attention only to the Kantian problematic. The second irony to be denoted is that Cavell, though he's much too acute a reader of Wittgenstein to fail to appreciate that later Wittgenstein is operating at a Kantian level, his whole discussion of criteria, I think, is bringing out the Kantian character of the problematic. He never sees that for Wittgenstein, as for Kant, the term skepticism can range over something other than a merely Cartesian problematic. He thinks that term is confined to a Cartesian anxiety. So, though Cavell carefully follows out the inner movement of a dialectic that Wittgenstein traces, which fetches up with a Kantian concern with the level at which criteria operate, he doesn't see that some of what McDowell wants to say about Wittgenstein could be right. As I said, this last quotation I gave you on the handout, quotation 11, though it's very important, as we said in the discussion with Matteo in the first day, that Cavell only does this in the other minds case. But in the other minds case, in this last quotation 11, you even see the problem turning into a Kantian skeptical problem at the end of this quotation. Now, Cavell thinks that's special about other minds, and so he doesn't see that this is part of a whole set of problems that can metamorphose in this way. And there's many passages in Wittgenstein, here are some examples, that are very important to Cavell. Wittgenstein saying things, only of a living human being, and what resembles a living human being, can one say it has sensations, it sees, it's blind, hears, is deaf, conscious or unconscious. That's section 281, investigations. Or Wittgenstein says, what has to be accepted, the given, is forms of life. Or section 283, what gives us so much is the idea that living beings, things, can feel. Or in page 178 of part 2, something I quoted in the first day, or alluded to in the first day, the human body is the best picture of the human soul. These are all passages that Cavell quotes in explaining Wittgenstein. And they all are passages in which Wittgenstein presents what Cavell says he understands as the background against which our criteria do their work, or even make sense. I think he's quite right about this. But I also want to say they are quintessential examples of moments in his work in which Wittgenstein's investigations are moving from the Cartesian to the Kantian level. So I take the presence of the Kantian problematic in much of Cavell, for instance, quotation 11 on the handout, to be self-evident. But I think that Cavell doesn't see the full implications of this. So he doesn't see how a passage like the rule-following problematic is expressing anxiety that comes about if one feels nothing could give me the idea, nothing could give me the picture that's here being discussed. And so when we have a discussion of the rule-following problematic, which itself is a kind of paradox, he thinks, now this is something we shouldn't be talking about. Our only paradoxes should be Cartesian paradoxes. And I think that leaves Cavell's account of Wittgenstein's treatment of skepticism essentially incomplete. So I think it's only a reading that's able to accommodate, both exegetically and philosophically, the insights contained in both Cavell's and McDowell's respective readings of Wittgenstein. That is, only one that understands why, in Wittgenstein's treatment of what for Wittgenstein is an extended, internally related philosophical dialectic, in which the moment that Cavell is focused on and the one that Cavell is focused on each form a part, and one in which neither variety of skepticism is privileged over the other. I think only such a reading of Wittgenstein will be a complete reading of Wittgenstein. So that's the end of the third lecture. And the end of all of the lectures I can put like this. What I've been trying to do is give you a perspicuous overview of two varieties of skepticism. If we had more time, we can complicate the list and have 3 or 4, but you can see that 2 is already complicated. 2 varieties of skepticism. And I've tried to give you some sense of the philosophical benefit that such a perspicuous overview affords. I think it can allow you to command a clearer view of the sort of relation that obtains between the problems and what are supposed to be unrelated areas of philosophy. I think it can allow you to distinguish very different things that philosophers mean when they employ what are apparently the same philosophical terms, and especially, of course, the term skepticism. I think can allow you to see more clearly what's distinctive about Kant's and Wittgenstein's respective contributions to the history of thought about skepticism. And also, I think it can allow you to see much more clearly why those two authors, Kant and Wittgenstein, are very often misread, and why their best commentators often misread one another, and even sometimes misunderstand themselves, taking themselves to disagree with one another when they do not, taking themselves to agree with one another when they do not, and taking themselves to be in agreement with themselves when they are not. Thank you. Shall we have some discussion?
I have a little observation.
Yes.
The first thing, I want to thank you for the beautiful 3 lessons.
Okay. Thank you.
My little reflection is this. You said that you have done a perspicuous observation.
Perspicuous overview. No problem.
Sorry,
Yeah.
On skepticism.
Yes.
But maybe you are doing something more, because I think you have talked a lot in this lesson about ethics, because the point of confusion between to be a Kantian and talking talking about Cartesian without knowing, that is an ethical point, and I think is deeply entangled in little observation if you want to add something.
Sure. Well, yeah, I think that's right. I think it bears on ethics. Ethics is itself a word that can be inflected in very different registers. And so,
As a genre, not
yes,
yeah.
yes. But there's the word ethics in Wittgenstein. And what it means, for instance, when Wittgenstein will say something like, the Tractatus has an ethical point. And then there's the word ethics as the name of something that contemporary philosophers would recognize as an area of philosophy that has its problems. And I think my lectures bear on both issues, but maybe it's worth separating them. So, in Wittgenstein, I think it's very important to him that that logical or conceptual or philosophical confusion and ethical confusion are not distinct species of confusion directed at different objects. So both logic and ethics are the name of activities that are concerned at the achievement of a certain sort of clarity. And I think he thinks these two forms of clarity come together or not at all. And I think this is a very deep point of continuity between early and later Wittgenstein. This is, a feature of Wittgenstein's thought that goes very early, and it's complicated and nuanced, but I think the sense of this idea that what he's doing in trying to achieve philosophical clarity itself has an ethical moment at every point. That never changes. And so, of course, it will be right about Wittgenstein insofar as my lectures are concerned to help us achieve certain kinds of clarity about what our problems are in philosophy. That this itself is much, for Wittgenstein, I think, an ethical work on ourselves as it is a philosophical work on ourselves. So that's certainly right. But that in itself involves a conception of ethics that I think is perhaps not entirely, but largely very foreign to what many philosophers think they mean by ethics. What they want to mean by ethics is an area of philosophy that has its own subject matter. Philosophy of mind is about this subject. Philosophy of language is about this stuff that comes out here. Philosophy of science is about some other way of representing the world. Ethics is about this other part of reality. So there's different subject. It's about that. So there's a picture of philosophy and what gives an area of philosophy its distinctive purview, in which one wants to have a picture of subject matters that can be distinguished. And each philosophy has its own set of problems because of its subject matter. I think if you understand fully the implications of what I'm saying in these lectures, and the way in which the problem has the same form in the supposedly different areas of philosophy, that itself becomes a ground for worrying whether areas of philosophy are really distinguishable in the way in which I think many of our institutions presuppose, in the way they imagine philosophical expertise to be constituted through your knowledge of your subject. So that's a second implication of what I'm saying for ethics, which I also think is quite Wittgensteinian, but it's not quite the same as the first. And then there's a third point, which is a little more removed from Wittgenstein, but I think still in his spirit, which is which could come into view if you imagine someone after my first lecture having asked a certain question. So in my first lecture, I said I gave you 3 variants of Cartesian skepticism. I gave you 3 variants of Kantian skepticism. And in the handout, I actually gave you 5 of each, so you could, at home, try a little further. But you could have asked me about some other area. Someone could have said, what about, philosophy of mathematics? So someone could have raised their hand and said, what about ethics? And now I would have taken the question to mean philosophers who think they're ethicists. Journals call things like ethics, or the journal of, ethical inquiry, or, something like that. Moral philosophy today. The articles published in those journals, are they concerned with 2 different kinds of problematics, one of which is Cartesian and one of which is Kantian, that mirror the ones I'm talking about? And then I would have said yes, and that would have been a further bearing of what I have to say about ethics that I don't think can be identified with either of the first 2 points I made. So I think there's sort of 3 ways in which this ethics can come into this, depending upon how Wittgensteinian or un-Wittgensteinian your conception of the ethical is. But I'll make one last point in connection with that third remark, which I think brings out something interesting about certain fields, which is, if you ask me about philosophy of perception, what's the Cartesian problematic, what's the Kantian problematic? I have one Cartesian variant, I have one Kantian variant for philosophy of perception. If you ask me about other minds, I have one variant. If you ask me about language, I really think there's one primary variant. That's why I picked those 3 things. When we talked about philosophy of action yesterday in our conversation, I gave you 2 variants of a Cartesian problematic in philosophy of action. One was one in which the movement was the same in both cases, but one was intentional and one wasn't. The other one was a variant in which the trying, the movement of the soul, we might say, was the same. But in one case there was an action, in another there wasn't. There are what seemed to people to be 2 problems there. I gave you Cartesian, but I could have given Kantian variants. But now if we choose a different area of philosophy, that already suggests that philosophy of action doesn't have quite as straightforward a unity. It's taking versions of problems from philosophy of perception and versions of problems from philosophy of mind and working on both of them at the same time. It wants to understand its topic merely in terms of subject matter, everything that has to do with action. But that doesn't give us, I think, a real philosophical area in the right way. And so what we get is a number of problems that share a form within the area. And if you pick something like philosophy of science, say, then I think, I can give you a version of a philosophy of perception problem in philosophy of science. I can give you a version of philosophy of mind problem that comes up in philosophy of science. I can give you a version of a philosophy of language problem that comes up in philosophy of science. Philosophy of science, thinking that putting philosophy in front of science with an of, gives you one set of clear problems that are all related. It's just a confusion. I mean, you just have all kinds of problems that somebody has arrived at thinking about science, which recapitulate many of our different variants, with a slightly different clothing. We talk about scientific observation now rather than perception, but we have the same problem of the value, theory-ladenness of observation, and so forth. And I think ethics is more like philosophy of science in that respect. In ethics, I think I can show you many different variants of a Cartesian skeptical problematic and many different variants of a Kantian skeptical problematic. There are issues about the will that are more like the case of trying in philosophy of action. There are problems about laws. There's a Cartesian problem about rules and laws. How do we know that we are going on in the right way? But there's a Kantian problem too. How can a law or a moral rule so much as have normative force? This is an important problem in certain strain of moral life. That's a Kantian problem, and so on. So I think there's many Cartesian variants and Kantian variants across ethics. Ethics, in that sense, I don't think names a clear philosophical unity, because the problems are only connected by the idea that somebody thinks they have a common subject matter. The ethics, imagining they know how to pick out the subject matter in advance. So I think the remarks I have made, I think, could be seen to have application in things that people call ethics in many ways. And if we saw the diversity of the ways in which they have application, we would also start to see, I think, in certain ways, what a mess people get into when they imagine that their thought has a unified topic for free because it's all concerned with ethics. I don't think that, that's a good way of picking out an area in philosophy. And so you often have people who are kind of wandering around, changing their problem without even realizing they're changing their problem. So I think, so my full answer to my question is, yes, I think it is concerned with ethics, but in 3 different ways.
I have in mind that a particular case of response to kind of skeptical question, this is the answer Clara Diamond gives in The Realistic Spirit, and in particular in the chapter Realism and the Realistic Spirit, where she tries to answer to Kripke's paradox, and she gives the example of about the remark on the foundations of mathematics with the 2 lines and 2 dots. And yeah, and the problem is how can we go on with this?
Yes, yes.
And she says something like, here is not the agreement of community as Kripke says that we must consider, but the relation in which the teacher and the pupil, and the way the pupil can look from within this kind of problem, and looking from within, giving the response to which is the right way to go on.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, I think this is the Kantian level, because it involves the capacity to give meanings to our intentional capacity to. And the other questions, so if you could say something about that, and if this kind of response is somehow related to Cavell and to his question of yesterday about autobiography and our practical contests in which we give response to a kind of Kantian skepticism, if I can say so. I'm not sure. So
Yes.
this is
Yes. Well, there's a lot in that question.
It's clear. I don't know.
It's clear enough for there to be too much to say already. First, let me just make a background remark, which I haven't said in these lectures, but maybe you sensed it, but in case it wasn't as explicit as it should have been, let me make it explicit. If you read people that talk about rule following, I think if you look carefully, I think you'll notice there are 2 different ways of characterizing the problem of rule following. One you find a little bit more in people like Brandom, Kripke, Brandom, Crispin Wright, Colin McGinn, Paul Boghossian, name some people. The other I think you find in people who are better readers of Wittgenstein, for all of their differences, Kripke, McDowell, Cavell, Diamond. And the difference is this. On the one account of rule following, the problem of rule following is, what is it to use a concept so that you apply it of the right thing in each case? So in this conception of rule following, when you use the concept, you must use it to say a true thing. I use red again, and as long as I'm using red and predicated if something is actually red, I am following the rule. If I say of something that's dark pink that it's red, I'm not following the rule. That's one way of understanding the rule following question. Another way of understanding what the fundamental question of rule following is to take the problem not what is it to predicate the concept correctly of an object, but what is it to go on in the same way? Or go on in the same way means that you are using the word in a way in which I can recognize as making sense. So to take the case about pain and pain behavior, if Matteo is only pretending to be in pain, and I say, I'm deceived, and I say he's in pain, I'm not following the rule according to the first people, because I've predicated pain of someone who's not in pain. According to the second group of people, we're trying to say the fundamental problem is what is to go in the same way. I am following the rule. When I say, I think Matteo's in pain, it's the concept pain I mean to be using. I might be wrong, but you understand what I'm saying, and you're being able to say, no, you're wrong. He's not in pain. We are both, in the relevant sense, using the concept the same way. I'm saying something true. You're saying something false. But what we're concerned about is the conditions of the intelligible use of the concept, not the conditions of the use of the concept to say something true. If I said, I think this is in pain, then there would be a problem. Then you couldn't see me as going on the same way. But not because I said something false, but because it's not clear how what I say could even be false. So in my vocabulary, I would say the first way of understanding rule following takes the problem to have too Cartesian a form. The second way of understanding what the issue of rule following is, what is going on, takes the problem to be concerned at a Kantian level. I think in the literature there's much confusion about this. A lot of people talking about rule following, they think they're talking about the same thing. But they're actually very different issues there. A related difference in the literature is you find people saying things like this. What Wittgenstein showed in his rule following discussion is it's not possible to think or to have a mind or to have language or to have X for some X without normativity. What does that mean? It means it must be possible to make a mistake. What does that mean? I think there's great disagreement about this. I think there's, without people realizing there's disagreement. So I think we agree that Wittgenstein has shown that normativity is required. That is, it must be possible to make a mistake. But I think there's a more Cartesian and a more Kantian understanding of that. The Cartesian understanding of it is it must actually be possible to make a mistake. We must make sense of your having substantively gone wrong. I think a really good example of this is Chris Korsgaard's reading of Kant, which, because he's a similar issue in Kant, which gives you a very Cartesian version of Kant. She thinks, something is only a moral law if we can actually break it. And so when Kant talks about the holy will, someone who's understanding, that just can't make any sense because it would violate the principle of normativity. And Aristotle, when he talks about the practically wise man, he's not making any sense. She thinks what this commits you to is a substantive possibility of going wrong at every point. Whereas I think a Kantian construal of that understanding, which is much closer to Wittgenstein, is we have to be able to make sense of the idea of going wrong. There must be something which is going wrong with respect to the rule. The claim doesn't have to be that my understanding of Matteo is such that his grasp of the concept must be sufficiently tenuous that he will sometimes go wrong. It's not a claim about, as it were, the substantive fallibility of his concepts. Once you have that kind of view, you get into a kind of Cartesian skepticism, I think, about our ever being able to exercise our concepts correctly. So what I'm trying to bring out here is that these issues about rule following, I've given you two examples of this, are themselves posed extremely unclearly in a lot. So I think one thing is happening in Cora Diamond's article, and you're right about this, is that she's taking the problem of rule following there to have what I call a Kantian form. It's about there being something that counts as going wrong. It's about going on the same way, where same way means I can see you as making sense, the same kind of sense I make. You're saying something false is perfectly consistent with your in the relevant sense going on the same way. Because I can see you using that concept to say this, but actually he's pretending. Actually it's pink, not red. But I can tell you that, and we can communicate. Because by red, you mean what I mean. And so if it's pink, you're wrong, and you can come to see you're wrong. You want to be using the concept the way I use it. So I agree with you about this, but the first thing I'm saying is I think this is quite an achievement of her article. Because she's very clear on that point. One of the things she's doing, and this is necessary for being able to connect it with those lines, it makes no sense about those lines. If you think the problem is a Cartesian one, what is it to be saying something false when you do this? Or what is it, to be something you can substantively go wrong with respect to? Then it looks like the relevant kind of normativity can't even be present in that example. So the importance of that analogy is connected with, I think, clarifying the dimension of the problematic. And so that's a tremendous clarity on her part, so I think lots of people read her article and they think, yeah, this is what people always say about rule following. But it's not what people always say about rule following. You have to hear the difference. So that's the first thing. So I'm just agreeing with you about something, but I'm trying to make it interesting that we agree about that. Now, to the heart of your question, in my lectures, my 3 lectures, what I did was very preliminary in a way. Hope you found it useful, but it was very preliminary. One really needs to go on in a way I didn't have time for in only 3 lectures. But the way in which it was preliminary is this. I talked about these 2 different problematics, the Cartesian one and the Kantian one. I talked very little about how to respond to each problematic. It came up in discussion a little bit, but it's not something it's something I have views about. But I think it's very hard to have a clear discussion about that without this preliminary clarity. And I want to, develop a way of talking about this where I can have a discussion about the appropriate response with someone who disagrees with me. But we have a clear way of talking about what we disagree about. So I think my terminology of Cartesian, Kantian, the way the features work, and so forth, does not depend upon your collateral views about what the appropriate response is. But there are issues about response then. And your question about core diamond is a question about, once one sees the rule-following problematic has a Kantian shape, what is the appropriate response to it? She's disagreeing with Kripke about that. Kripke thinks there's a sense in which once you see the problem, you're stuck with the problem. We might put the point by saying, Kripke thinks the Kripke thinks the Kantian gap is just there. Let's live with it. All there are marks and noises. We believe that there's something which is going on the right way, using words determinately according to a sense, but that's an illusion. And he calls what he has a Humean solution modeled on Hume, saying, well, here's a way to talk, cause talk. But of course there are no causal connections. Here's a way to talk, meaning talk, in the wake of Wittgenstein's skeptical paradox, but don't think there really is something which is using a word according to its meaning. That's Kripke's response to the Kantian paradox. His response to the Kantian paradox is, in a sense, to accept its existence. Whereas I think Wittgenstein's response to anything Wittgenstein would call a skeptical paradox, Cartesian, Kantian, otherwise, is always to try to show not that what this paradox is about is an illusion, and this is how we go on and live with the illusion, but rather that the paradox itself is an illusory paradox. So what Wittgenstein wants to show is the problem which we've now clarified in its Kantian form, that there is no way to go on in the same way, itself is based on a misunderstanding. Wittgenstein, right in 201, after he formulates the paradox about rule following, whose form I think Kripke is right, goes on and says, and Kripke really does not see this, but we can see this is based on a misunderstanding. And then when he says what the misunderstanding is, he says, what we have to come to see is there is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation. So the Kantian problematic about rule following depends upon this assumption. It's an assumption that Cartesian already makes. But we see the urgent consequences fully of this assumption once the problem takes a Kantian form. We can see more clearly this assumption is no longer innocent. We can no longer see this assumption as innocent. The assumption is that the signpost just stands there. And to understand it, I must add something that is external to the signpost. This is always the fundamental structure of these problems. There are 2 things that are being conjoined that don't seem to be connected in the right way. My knowledge of his pain, something inner and something outer, and how can they come together? There's the sign and there's the meaning. How can they come together? And that's the fundamental assumption that's being attacked. And I think that's what Cora Diamond is trying to show us in that article. So she's discussing Wittgenstein's response to this problem and what it would be to dissolve the problem rather than to give a skeptical solution to the problem. And that's the level at which she's distinguishing herself from Kripke. And that goes beyond anything I've said in this lecture, because it goes to this extra step of how we should respond to any of these paradoxes. But I'm actually, as you might have guessed, very much in agreement with her about this. But I think one can see more clearly what she's doing and why it has such important consequences, all the way back for the Cartesian case, if one has a clear overview of the problem and what's distinctive about her approach. So I do think of the kind of thing I'm doing as, I hope, a helpful prolegomenon to reading an article like that by Coral Diamond. But I didn't ever, in my lectures themselves, arrive at the point where she's arriving in the conclusion of that article. So I agree with what you said about that, but I'm also explaining why it was that that agreement isn't present here. I would need a few more lectures to arrive at that, following the path of my lectures. Should we stop? Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure lecturing in this beautiful place to you.